Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Grace. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are and that you're taking good care of yourself. I am going to be talking in this video about my experience going to a Danish university as an international student. I'm going to be talking about what the class schedule was like, what the workload was like, how it is if you have like a student job alongside your studies, how exams were, what the social life was like, what the diversity was like in my program. So all the little details, and if you have any questions, you can ask me in the comments. I'd be more than happy to answer them as best as I can. Before we get started though, I do want to give you a little bit of background information, like where I was going, what I was studying, because obviously not every Danish university is exactly the same. I was studying at the Copenhagen Business School, also known as CBS. I was studying business, language, and culture. That was my bachelor's degree. It was a 3-year program. They no longer have it, unfortunately, because they did cut some programs recently, but I enjoyed it. I'm from the US. I'm specifically from New Jersey. I'm from a suburban area, and that's the perspective I'm bringing. Not every American is going to have the same perspective as me. Not every international student is going to have the same experience as me. Also, obviously, different programs, even at the same university, could have been different. I'm just talking about what my personal experience was. First off, I want to talk about the class schedule. So you might end up having class only 4 days a week or so, at least in my program. You might have it 5 days a week, but typically it's not going to be like a full day of classes every day. Regarding the actual length of the classes, I think a typical class was like an hour and a half or like an hour and 40 minutes, if I'm remembering correctly. I want to say it's like for every 40 or like 50 minutes of class, you have a 10-minute break. Professors are pretty good about breaking up the classes, especially for the longer classes. So in my program, there were basically 2 kinds of classes you could have. It would be like a lecture class or it would be an exercise class. Most courses would have mostly lectures, and then those would usually be, like I said, around 1.5 hours or like an hour and 40. Unless they were a very like math heavy class, like for example, my microeconomics class, or I think like my accounting classes, those were like, oh my god, those were so long. They were like, I think like 2.5 or like 3 hours or something. And yeah, they were really long. But they, again, like I said, they have the breaks throughout the time. Exercise classes are different from lectures because they're typically not in like a lecture hall. They might be in like a typical classroom, I guess you could say. And you usually have like TAs who are helping you go through different math problems. That was my experience. It could have been different in other classes. The next thing I want to talk about is the workload. So in a semester, in my program, there were not very many actual graded assignments throughout the semester. A lot of my classes didn't actually have any graded assignments throughout the semester, and the whole grade for the class was the final exam. That works great for some people. It doesn't work great for everybody, and I'm not sure if it's like this in all universities. I know this was pretty common at CBS specifically, and it's definitely something to ask about if you have like the chance to ask like some admissions people or like people from the program. Some classes might have like a quiz once or twice throughout, or maybe there's like one graded assignment that you have in the middle of the semester. I don't think I ever had more than maybe like 2 actual graded assignments in a course throughout the semester. So that being said, what are you doing throughout the semester? You're going to classes, the lectures, the exercise classes, and then you have readings assigned every week. The professors expect that you read for the classes, but they assign a lot of reading, and you have that for all of your classes. Like you might technically on paper have to read like 40 pages for one class for the week, and you also have 3 or 4 other classes. That's like math, what, 160 pages that you're supposed to read every week, which is like not really realistic. It's really dense information. And in the beginning, I think everybody kind of struggles a bit with figuring out, do I need to really read this word for word, or can I just kind of skim it? Do I need to look at this at all, or are we just going to talk about it in class and I can get the main ideas from the slides? Like, you're going to find your way. Most students are not reading every single text. To be honest, I did not read a lot during my program. The only class that I read for very consistently, where I literally read every single thing, was my Spanish class, and we had to read reports and stuff and news articles in Spanish every week, and I was like, okay, if I'm going to improve, I need to read every single one of these. I was deep in, but for the other classes, I was like, yeah, we'll see. But in general, I did very well on like most of my exams, so you just have to figure out what works for you. Also, how many classes are you taking at once? I was taking 4 classes each semester, I think, and that was like at my university, and I think this is pretty common in Denmark. You just have like set classes that you take until a certain semester which is like the exchange slash internship slash elective semester, during which you could take other classes of your choice. But it's like, okay, semester 1, you take this class, this class, this class, and this class. Semester 2, boom, boom, boom. Like, it's set. The next thing I want to talk about is working alongside your studies. So I actually didn't work very much in my bachelor's degree. My parents were, I was fortunate that they were able to support me and they were willing to support me through my bachelor's degree financially. I did have like some small jobs here and there, but a lot of my classmates did have student jobs alongside studying. Basically, most European countries, if you're from one of them and you're studying there and you work at least, I think when I was there, it was at least 10 hours a week, don't quote me on this, then you can get ESU, which is like a monthly stipend from the government to help you cover your living costs while you're studying. So a lot of my classmates were working at least 10 hours a week and they were doing perfectly fine. Also in Denmark, the attendance, I think this is important to say, at least in my program and I think in my university in general, no class is mandatory to attend. The only thing that you need to attend is the final exam. If you have a part-time job and it overlaps with your classes, it's not a big deal if you have to skip class, except for if you feel like, of course, it's affecting your academic performance. So I mentioned that I didn't actually work that much alongside my studies, but now that I'm in my master's degree, and it's actually a lot more demanding than my bachelor's degree, and I am working usually 15 to 20 hours per week, and it's still been manageable, I would definitely say that you can have a part-time job alongside your studies. Now let's discuss exams. Since I mentioned before that they are usually 100% of the grade for a course or 80% of the grade for a course, like what should you even be expecting with this? Hey guys, I forgot to mention while filming that the exam period can be quite long since exams have so much weight. For example, I often had exams in winter from late November or early December until occasionally mid-January, with most happening before Christmas, but maybe one in January after the New Year. And then in the spring, they would take place usually from start of May to mid to late June. There were a few different types of exams you could have. There's like the classic written sit-in exam. That's when you would go to an exam hall and you show like your student ID, you go to these computers that are school owned, and then there are these exam proctors kind of just like walking around and making sure, you know, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing basically. All of my written sit-in exams, you had 4 hours to complete them. I often ended up using like the full 4 hours or like 3.5. I think they also have accommodations if you have any kind of like learning disability, or if you just need any kind of extra assistance, if you have like a medical disability that might affect your ability to focus. So these written sit-in exams, they can be like open or closed book. I thought for one of my exams that I was going to be allowed to use the calculator on the computer. Turned out I was not, and that was my I think it was my microeconomics exam. It was like such a stressful course. I was doing like long division by hand on my like scrap paper and stuff. So make sure you always double check with that. Sometimes you can literally bring like a USB of like all of your notes if you want to. Sometimes it's completely closed book. Also, all exams at my university were completely anonymous. You have like a exam or like student exam number. They're grading your papers just looking at that number. Like they have no idea who you are, and that's to prevent any kind of like bias. The next type of exam that I want to discuss is oral exams. And if you're like me and you're from the US, like you probably have never had an oral exam, or like at most maybe in like a language class. Like I had absolutely no idea what to expect with oral exams, and like they stressed me out. Like I usually, when you have an oral exam, my experience was you go into a room with a professor from the course and then an external examiner, and they will ask you different questions about topics relating to the course and try to get you to show what you know basically about the material that was covered. Like, I never even know how to tell people to prepare for these exams because you never know what they're gonna ask you about. I've had oral exams where you can bring in like a 1-page sheet of notes with you. It can really vary based on the class. In oral exams, I guess my advice would be, even if you're not super confident on the thing that they're asking you about, like if there's something else related that you think you could bring in, you can talk more about it. Like always try to show what you know, like show as much as possible. Bring in as many different things as possible that you can, like from the course, like topic-wise. But yeah, good luck. The last thing I'll say about oral exams is that in my program, we had a bachelor's thesis, which was like the last exam of the entire program, where you have to write like a 15-credit thesis. Each semester is 30 credits, and then you present it to a professor from the course, and like I said, an external examiner. And then you have to like defend it. And that is basically the last exam of your entire program. And essentially, the most important day of your program where you're kind of graduating. I think they do have some graduation ceremonies in Denmark, but honestly, like nobody really goes to them. Like the most important, at least in my school, like the most important day is your final exam. So you like do it, and then usually you have like friends and family waiting outside, and you like celebrate with drinks and like snacks and stuff like that in one of the university buildings. Now let's get into what the experience is like in a classroom in Denmark and what the culture is like. People are very casual in Denmark. Like you would address all your professors on a first name basis, like across the board, even the foreign professors. And that definitely took me some getting used to. As I mentioned earlier, you have the lecture classes versus the exercise classes. Exercise classes are a lot more like hands-on and interactive. If it's not for a math-related course, it could also be something where you're like discussing things in groups. In the lectures, it depends on the professor how much they like engage the students. You are always welcome to ask questions during lectures, but I found that generally in my program anyway, people like, this is one of the only things that I maybe didn't like as much about the university experience in Denmark, is that I found that people generally were not that like open to participating. There were professors that genuinely tried to get people to be involved and like to have a discussion during the lecture, and like people were just kind of reluctant to like raise their hands and participate. You know, I think it's also like respectful to reciprocate like the energy that they're giving you. I think people are just a little bit shyer in Denmark in terms of like the academic environment and competitiveness. My program specifically was not very competitive, I would say. I would say I'm a bit more like type A, or like very academically ambitious, and I came from a very intense competitive high school before I went to Denmark. So on the one hand, I was so glad to be in this environment because it was like a breath of fresh air. On the other hand, I do wish sometimes that people were a bit more motivated. There were definitely some other programs that like specifically that had a reputation for being more competitive, more cutthroat, with people being very like ambitious, which is good, but like sometimes almost in a toxic way is what I heard. For example, international business, also international business and politics. I know these were some of the most competitive programs to get into at the university. And from what I heard from those students, they were also like, the environment was a bit different. Maybe people were a bit more tense and like competitive with each other. As for the social life, I would say sometimes it could be a bit weak in my program, just because not everybody would come to class. And especially for like smaller classes, like my Spanish classes, where we were split into like 2 groups, sometimes there would be like 3 people that showed up for class. That I think made it a little bit more difficult to connect with students, you know, if half of them aren't there. I would say the other difficult thing was there was like an introductory week where they encouraged everybody, including the Danish students, to speak English, just because it really makes it easier for international students and Danish students to mingle. Like, obviously I'm not gonna hate on anyone for speaking their own language, you know, like we're in Denmark, I understand people are gonna speak Danish. So like, please don't take this as me being like, whoa, everybody should speak English. I'm just commenting on the fact that after the intro week, the amount of like people speaking English together like in class and like kind of died down. And I think that made it so that there was kind of like the Danish students and there were like the international students, and I kind of wish we had mingled a bit more. Most of my friends did end up being international students, and I also noticed that a lot of my friends who were Danish students, a lot of them that were Danish were not ethnically Danish, so I thought that was interesting. I don't know, maybe they're just used to being in like more multilingual environments, if like they speak a different language at home, or I don't really know what the connection was there, but just thought it was interesting. As for actual like activities and things like parties, so every year there would be a few parties that were for students from all programs. That was a good way to like, theoretically good way to meet people from the programs. Like, everybody kind of already had their group when they would go, so I didn't actually like meet that many people from different programs. I would say the main way to meet people from other programs is to maybe join like clubs and activities. I was, for example, in International Student Ambassadors. At my school, they had clubs that were open to everybody, like CBS dance. They also had clubs that you had to like apply to get into. I would say, generally speaking though, socializing in a university setting in Denmark can require some effort. Yeah, you can see people in passing and like talk during class, but like, I would say the real magic happens when you take those relationships outside of the classroom. The other thing that I haven't really mentioned yet is that in Denmark, there aren't really like dorms in the sense, like in the same way that there are in the US. In the US, you have dorms where like only people from that university are living in the dorm. In Denmark, there are like student housing buildings throughout the city, but they're for anyone from any university. You might have a few different communities that you're in where you're like, you have your classmates, you have the people from your dorm that you're living in that you might hang out with, like in the shared kitchen. But if you're also looking for other social activities in Denmark, like there are Facebook groups that are really popular in Denmark that you could find, like running clubs. But in general, especially like for the winter, like you need to keep busy. So definitely it's worth putting in the effort, even if you feel a little bit socially awkward, like of getting to know people and really building your social support system. The last thing that I'm going to talk about in this video is the diversity in my program. So first of all, my program was about, the stats were like 40% international and like 60% domestic, like Danish students. I will say though, it didn't feel like 40% international students when I was there, because like a lot of and I was totally not expecting this, and now that I'm looking back, I'm like, oh, it kind of makes a lot of sense. And like, I just wish I had anticipated this more, but you don't know until you know. Most of the international students were from Sweden and Germany. And like, yes, those are technically international students. They speak different languages. They do have slightly different cultures. But like, when you look in a room of people, like, everybody's white. So like, I was just like, okay, you know, this is, which is, yeah, I'm in Europe. I know there are going to be a lot of white people. So I'm not hating on there being white people. Because, you know, in the US, for example, when people are talking about the international student body, it's oftentimes students from China, from India, from Nigeria, you know, like people literally from like all over the world, not like your neighboring country. So I was, beyond even just like race or anything like that, I was just expecting it to be like a more diverse spread of international students. However, I have heard this is different at the master's level because there are so many more master's programs in English. I mean, people are a bit more open to traveling for master's degrees. One other thing that I will mention though about most of the other international students being from Europe is that it can be a bit lonely if you are one of the few who is not from the EU, EEA, because you have a completely different visa process. Like, I mean, most of these students from Europe can just basically move freely within Europe and then just register their residence somewhere else. But like, you're gonna have to go through, like I did, you'll have to go through the whole like, visa application process, getting the residence permit, doing all the immigration stuff, having a different set of rights when you're in the country. As for the gender split, in my program, there were more women than men, and that of course varies between program as well. As for like non-binary students, I wasn't super aware of any in my program. I could have also just not known them personally. However, I would say that generally speaking, Denmark is fairly like LGBTQ plus friendly. There were also some queer students in my program. If you have more experiences on that though, I would love to hear your experience. Lastly, I have gotten some questions, I think mostly from Muslim viewers, about if there were many Muslim students at CBS. I'm hesitant to give my response because it can be difficult to identify Muslim students sometimes, like beyond just making like assumptions based on appearance. But in my program, for example, there was only one girl who was very like clearly Muslim out of like maybe 50 students or so. Also, just like walking around CBS, like I didn't notice that many students like who were ethnically from predominantly Muslim countries. I do have a friend though who is ethnically Bosnian, and she is Muslim and like wears hijab, and she's had pretty decent experiences from what I've discussed with her about like being at CBS and just being in Denmark in general. All right, we have reached the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it all the way through. I would love to hear any questions that you might have about studying in Denmark or my experience at CBS specifically. I'm also going to be doing a follow-up video where I talk about my experience with applying for the student visa, also applying for to go to university. Yep, that is all. Thank you. I hope you have a great day. Drink some water, get some fresh air, and see you next time. Bye.